All right, welcome back, y'all. This is going to be lecture two, and this is going to be chapter one, the context of Latin American politics. So we'll just jump right in. Section zero is the intro, the land, and the people. I'm going to just try to hit on the highlights in all of these chapters and try to add some of my own knowledge and some other research. But okay, social status in South America is a little like in America and a little different, right? It's very much dictated by history of slavery and the sort of Euro white population as the elites, right? And the enslaved Black Africans at the bottom. And then sort of the indigenous and the mixed, right? Whether you want to say mestizo, which is like Spanish Black, or mulatto, which is like Spanish white. I know we don't really use that in our language anymore, but they still use it pretty heavily in Latin America. Um, but in Latin America, there's sort of this gradation, right, between black and white. It's not like you're black, you're white. It's this weird whole spectrum, right? But we do know that elites, who tend to generally be white Euro, tend to receive the best education, the best services, the best land, the best access to internet and electricity and clean water, the best roads, etc. Unlike in the US, women were not allowed to colonize with the Spanish, right? It was completely military conquest. There were no women, whereas in the United States, many of the pilgrims and many of those who came over to escape jail or to escape debt or whatever it was, right? They weren't all like Puritans. That's a silly idea. Uh, but yeah, they were allowed to bring wives or girlfriends or whatever it was and sort of try and start a family. Well, the Spanish were not allowed to do this, and so there was a lot of not just intercourse but rape with the local population, and so you get a much wider variation in the sort of skin color and the mixtures of the population, especially in places like Brazil, right? There are also huge differences in language. There are hundreds of languages spoken in Latin America. Many of them are just now starting to get some protection by like the World Heritage Foundation and the UN. Many have already died out, we know. Um, but we also know that native speakers tend to be higher status than foreign language speakers in Latin America. And I would say it's probably the same in the United States. There's wonderful, remarkable agricultural land in South America, some of the best on earth. This is why we get such an abundance of things like coffee, sugar, which is hard to grow, bananas, cacao, which is also very hard to grow and to harvest. Lots of fruit and flowers. I said bananas. Drugs, obviously, when it comes to coca, marijuana, things like that. And they don't really touch on this in the book, but it's really interesting if you look at some of the geographic history, or the geologic history of South America. A lot of this sort of Amazonian basin and some of this beautiful soil that they have in the Amazon is driven by the spin of the earth, right? And the winds that are picked up from sub-Saharan Africa in the deserts and flown all the way across the Atlantic Ocean and dumped in the South African basin, basically. And so all of the nutrients and the minerals and the soil sort of gets blown off, and you get the desertification of Africa, while you get the abundance that we see in South America. So it's very interesting how such a distant land could have such a great effect on South America's farmland. Okay. We're also learning that there's more and more oil being found in South America, especially off the coasts. Brazil just found an enormous deposit. Honduras just found a deposit. Mexico obviously has been funding itself for a long time. That's basically the entire Venezuelan economy. Um, But it wasn't there during industrialization, right? And so Latin America sort of fell behind the United States and Europe, which had access to sort of Middle Eastern, Iraqi, Turkish, Iranian oil, whereas South America didn't really have much access to that stuff. And it was a lot more expensive to try and ship it, right? Okay, section one is about Latin America's economic development. European history and their economy, right, are based on mercantilism. And mercantilism was just the idea that, like, you go out and act rapaciously on the world, steal as much and abuse and exploit as much as you possibly can to bring as much as you can back to the homeland, right? So that we can make the homeland wealthy and further extenuate our colonization efforts. It was extractive as hell, right? It was highly exploitative and also often abusive. It was largely driven by slavery. As we know, they introduced numerous diseases that did devastating things to the populations. It's a pretty rough period. And basically, the only infrastructure they would ever put in was infrastructure that was damn necessary for extraction. Right? It wasn't to better the population; it was to get the silver and gold out of the ground and as quickly get it to the ships as you possibly can, right? So that it can be transported back to the homeland and invested. Um, Sorry, I got to plug in my computer. Latin America tried to get into industrialization and shipping in the late 19th century, but unfortunately, most of their markets were based on these highly volatile commodities, right? These first level products um, and agricultural products. So you're talking about minerals, right, like copper, um, iron ore, if they could find it, but mostly ag products and things like beef or sheep or goats. And so they were very, very sort of first level products that was not a diversified economy in any way. And so their economies were highly volatile, right? They're based on sort of the vicissitudes of commodities market prices. And if those crash, you're in real trouble, right? Like all of your assets are now worth nothing. Um, and so this lack of diversity caused real economic collapses. It caused starvation and revolutions, especially in the 1930s when the United States market collapsed in 1929, and then the euro market collapsed shortly thereafter in 1930. Latin America had severe problems. Most of Latin America experienced military coups during that time. The vast majority of them were military coups. Um, they finally start to pick up a little bit post-industrialization in the 1930s, right? But they're still way, way behind. They have no liquidity. They really don't have a lot of like say gold or oil or things like that. At least at the time, they have no assets, so they can't really import things. So they attempted what's called ISI, and we'll talk more about this later in the book. But ISI is what's known as import substitution industrialization, and this is to be compared against export-oriented industrialization, right? Which was what Japan, South Korea, Vietnam, China, etc., all participated in. You can see how well those economies are doing. Unfortunately, Latin America took a different route called ISI, import substitution industrialization. This is where instead of importing goods, and instead of trying to beef up their exports and things like, what they had comparative advantage in, like agriculture and ranching and things like this, they borrowed a crap load of money. They bought the technology and high level manufacturing products necessary to build their own factories, right? Um, so that instead of buying cars from Europe or America, or buying refrigerators from Europe or America, or buying, all of these, high level products, they were going to build their own industrial bases, right, where they could sell these products to their own citizens and then eventually compete internationally, right? But it was a mess. It was an absolute mess. Instead, they got themselves in deep, deep debt. They were not able to push forward the technology and compete on the international markets. They had corrupt business practices and inefficiency, and it led to their complete downfall and collapse of their economies in the 60s and 70s, which we'll talk about. Uh, this led to mass inequality, right? It led to failing institutions, and in many cases, again, militaries took over. It led to nationalized industries that were run very corruptly and inefficiently, like we talked about. In Brazil, for example, the public utilities would be run by like the president's kid. In Mexico, the cronies of the Mexican president ran Pemex, right? The Mexican oil company. And just pass that down to dozens of industries where just cronies are running them, and then the cronies are hiring their cronies to run them, and then they're hiring their cronies to operate the machinery. And so like these businesses sucked. Nobody knew what the hell they were doing, and of course they couldn't compete with actual capitalism, right? Where capitalism drives you to be innovative, and to build efficiencies in the models, etc. Instead, these companies are having billions of dollars dumped into them by their national governments, and they're just being run into the ground. Um, okay, let's see. So yeah, post World War II led to these ISI policies. You also got this rising demand for social services, right? Which we kind of touched on earlier with the PRI in Mexico, where they're just giving handouts left and right and left and right. They think that this is going to allow them to reduce poverty, and it's eventually, it's going to build an interior market where people are buying goods built in our home country, right? Which is an interesting idea, and it's utopian, right? It would be good if it actually worked, but it didn't. Because again, you're just feeding money to people, and you're feeding money to these companies. Um, the people learn to depend on it. Um, they're being hired into these government jobs, at high wages when they're not really functioning in any way. And so in the 70s and 80s, you get the oil crisis, and you get complete collapse in Latin America. They stop paying their debts. They go into uh, debt default. They're hacking up all of these like extra fees because they're not paying their debts. Investors flood out of their economies, right? They call it capital flight. So everybody leaves and puts their money back into like the US stock markets because they're freaking out. All of their currencies collapse. You start to get hyperinflation. So I mean, you get literally like hundreds of thousands of percent inflation in countries like Argentina, where like today I'm paying $1 for bread. In 1 month from now, it'll cost me $1,000. A month from then, it'll cost me $20,000. That sort of thing. Like it's absolutely insane. Um, and so, in order to get some debt relief from the IMF and the World Bank in the 1990s, and from the U.S. government, let's be honest, they had to basically push what was called liberalization, right, or the Washington Consensus, or neoliberalism. There's a lot of different terms for it. But this basically meant that they had to sell off their state assets, right? And most countries did, not all. Argentina held on to some, Brazil held on to some, Mexico held on to its national oil company, but most sold them off. They want austerity and reductions in social services, right? You got to stop paying citizens to do nothing. You got to cut bureaucratic positions. You got to cut welfare programs. Um, they wanted you to peg your currency to the dollar, instead of having floating currency, right? So that we could control the inflation that was happening. They needed much more independent central banks, right? This is like in the United States, we have a very, very central federal bank, an independent Fed, right? Where the Fed is in charge of how much money is in the system and the inflation rate, not the inflation rate, but the interest rate in the system, right, to combat inflation. and to make sure the economy is neither moving too slowly or too quickly. And so recently the Fed dropped rates because inflation is finally coming down. But in a lot of these countries, the president controls the central bank. And so they will manipulate the economy right before an election to get a big pop in the economy so that they get reelected. But that's really bad for the economy in the long run, right? And so the IMF and the World Bank said, you got to stop doing that. The president cannot have control over the central bank. Um, they put in capital flight restrictions and minimal investment periods. This was really important in Argentina. They said, okay, if you're going to put your money here and our currency collapse or something goes wrong, you still can't move it for 6 months minimum. So that all of this capital could flood out, right? Because they had billions of dollars, like 30% of their entire economy flooded out. Let's see. And then Chile and Brazil, and especially Mexico, due to sort of proximity to the United States, were major beneficiaries of these projects and neoliberalism, as we'll talk about later, although they have caused some extreme frustrations from citizens. Okay, section two, classes and social forces. Again, we touched on this earlier. It's still a class-based society. It's very mixed with racial cues and language cues. I would also say that extreme poverty is dropping. It used to be, 1 in 5, 1 in 4 people were in extreme poverty. That means less than $2 US a day, according to the UN. Now it's down to about 9 or 10%. So it's still a big number, right? 1 in 10 or 1 in 11 people, but it's halved. And it is especially widespread in indigenous communities and in rural communities. Okay, section three, changing political values. These, I would say, are largely measured. We need to talk about measurements. It's important in social sciences. So, in order to measure values, quote unquote, we use what's called the World Values Survey. It's conducted in about 120 countries every 4 to 6 years, I think. They've been doing it since the mid 70s. It's one of the major projects of Ronald Inglehart, who we'll touch on a few times in here, the guy who sort of built up postmodernization theory. Um, and it also comes from the Latino Barometer, which is a sort of a regional version of the World Values Survey, right? That does it like on off years. Okay. The views are largely different in Latin America due to sort of religion and feudalism, right? There's a lot more elitism in Latin America than there is in the US. There's a lot more just acceptance that that guy's supposed to be rich because he's rich and I'm going to be poor because I'm poor and I was born that way. A lot of American citizens don't really think that way, right? Whereas that's a very, very strong idea in Latin American politics. It's a lot more authoritarian. Again, this can be traced back colonially to the Spanish and sort of the Spanish War with the Moors. I would also argue it has to do with their sort of culture of the priesthood, right, and Roman Catholicism, where there's a very, very strong top-down hierarchy that doesn't always necessarily exist in Protestantism and evangelicalism, that is very, very pronounced in Roman Catholicism. It tends to be much more patriarchal and machismo, right? We also see that there's a lot of violence against women in South America and Latin America. It is a real problem to this day. About 40 to 50% of women say they are the victims of physical abuse in Latin America. Rape rates are far higher, especially in those countries that are sort of collapsing, like the Middle Corridor in Venezuela. It's a lot harder to get a job too. There's not really protections in the constitutions or in bills of rights, etc., that protect gender, right? And so you're allowed to basically fire someone because they're a woman or because they're pregnant or whatever. So it's quite different there. Let's see. Oh, they have the history of this what's called the Great Chain of Being, and this is what I was touching on earlier with the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church has this very strong hierarchy, right? From like God to, I guess, God's son, and then to like Mary, and then to the king, and then the viceroy, and then the general, and blah, 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 down to the soldier, and then down to like the townsman, and then the indigenous, and then the slave, right down to the very bottom. And so, like, they have this crazy hierarchy laid out for everybody in society. Um, and basically, the Catholic Church eventually decided that indigenous actually had souls and that they could be laborers but not slaves, but that the Spanish landowners had a moral and state obligation to, I guess, Christianize them. So but that African Americans or Africans, I guess I should say, or blacks did not have souls and therefore could be slaves. So there's some really dark history here, right? They also have a major sort of political value called corporatism, that we don't really have in the United States, right? And this is that you have these organizations who are in charge of running and managing and operating a state. And basically, anyone who's not on that list doesn't get access, right? Um, it's kind of interesting. And they say it's the organization of a state's interest under state regulation and control rather than a basis of freedom of association. And so only a few groups are really allowed to participate in Latin America. You have a small handful of powerful players: the church, the armed forces, the landowners, right, who are incredibly important in South America, the business elites who are rising in importance in South America, and then again, more recently, the trade unions. But for the most part, it's been a lot of the church and the armed forces picking who the presidents are. You also get this. We also have this history of political patronage, right? Where like my son is expected to be the king after me, or my son is expected to be the leader of this business after me, or my friend is going to get this government position because he's my friend, not because he's you know, meritorious, right? So there's a lot less sort of merit in Latin America and a whole lot more patronage in Latin America, excuse me, and sort of quid pro quo, right? You give me this, I'll give you that kind of thing. And then there are some major sort of rifts in Latin America that we should talk about. We have sort of authoritarianism and the landed gentry and the military tied together, right? That's going to be one. And then you have sort of pluralism and the urban middle class, right, fighting for democracy. That's two. And then one that we've never really had in the United States is sort of the Marxist and socialist movement will be the third. And this often sort of involved and revolved around what's called liberationist theology from some members of the Roman Catholic Church in Latin America that we will talk about. So the current, no, I guess the former Pope Ratzinger, I don't remember his Pope name, but his real name was Ratzinger, Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger. He hated liberationist theology. He was also maybe a Nazi sympathizer, but yeah, he really really disliked liberationist theology coming out of South America, where he was from. I believe he was from Poland, and had a very very different view of Marxism and socialism, of course, than Latin America did. So, there's some tensions in the church that we'll talk about later. Okay, that's the end of the chapter. That was chapter two, chapter one, lecture two. I'll see you for the next one soon. Have a great day.